The call came at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. "Mrs. Sarah Mitchell, this is First National Bank. Your joint savings account is showing a negative balance of 3,247. I nearly dropped my coffee. Negative? That was impossible. We had $47,000 in that account just 3 months ago. When David walked through the door that evening, I confronted him with the bank statement. His face went pale, then red. Then he started stammering about banking errors and system glitches. That's when my friend Jessica, who was visiting for dinner, leaned over and whispered urgently in my ear, "Sarah, something is very, very wrong here. Banks don't just lose $50,000. I had no idea that this phone call would lead me to discover the most elaborate betrayal of my life and accidentally hand me the keys to the most satisfying revenge. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Looking back, I realize how perfectly crafted our life appeared from the outside. David and I had been married for 8 years, and everyone always commented on what an ideal couple we made. We met in college, dated for 3 years, and had what everyone called a fairy tale wedding in my hometown. I was a third-grade teacher at Riverside Elementary, and David worked as a mid-level insurance manager at Hartford Associates. We weren't wealthy, but we lived comfortably in our modest 2-bedroom house with the white picket fence and carefully maintained garden. I handled all our finances because, frankly, David couldn't balance a checkbook to save his life. He was the fun one, the spontaneous one who would surprise me with weekend trips or random bouquets of flowers. I was the planner, the saver, the one who made sure our bills were paid and our retirement accounts were growing. It worked for us, or so I thought. David's grandmother, Eleanor, had passed away 2 years into our marriage, leaving him a substantial trust fund that we rarely talked about. The lawyers handling the estate had explained that since David was married, his spouse would automatically be listed as the primary beneficiary, which was apparently standard practice in their family. David had signed whatever papers they put in front of him without really reading them, joking that he was terrible with legal stuff and that I should handle anything important. The trust fund felt like this distant safety net that we never needed to think about because we were doing fine on our own. David would sometimes mention it casually, saying things like, "Well, we've always got Grandma Eleanor's money, if we ever need it," but he never seemed interested in the details. I remember asking him once how much was in it, and he just shrugged and said, "I don't know enough." That was so typical of David, floating through life without worrying about the specifics while I handled all the grown-up responsibilities. Our friends always said we balanced each other out perfectly. I brought stability and common sense to his carefree nature, and he brought adventure and spontaneity to my carefully organized world. We had plans, dreams, goals. We talked about starting a family, maybe buying a bigger house in a few years, taking that European vacation we'd been saving for. Everything seemed so secure, so predictable, so safe. I trusted David completely, which now feels like the most naive thing I've ever done. But how could I have known that the man who couldn't remember to pay the electric bill was secretly orchestrating the most calculated betrayal of my life? Now that I think about it, the signs were everywhere. I just didn't want to see them. About 4 months ago, David started working late, more frequently. He'd text me around 5 p.m. saying he had to stay for a client meeting or help with a big presentation. When I'd ask how it went the next day, he'd give vague answers like, "Oh, same old insurance stuff," and quickly change the subject. He bought new cologne too, this expensive Tom Ford scent that cost more than we usually spent on groceries for a week. When I commented on it, he said his old cologne just wasn't working anymore and that he wanted to smell professional for clients. I actually thought it was sweet that he was taking more pride in his appearance. The phone thing should have been a dead giveaway. David used to leave his phone lying around everywhere, sometimes asking me to check his messages while he was driving. Suddenly, it was glued to his hand. He'd take it to the bathroom, keep it face down during dinner, and I noticed he'd started sleeping with it under his pillow instead of on the nightstand. When I jokingly asked if he was hiding something, he laughed it off and said work had been sending him emails at all hours, and he didn't want to wake me up with notifications. Then there were the work dinners. David had never been much of a schmoozer, but suddenly he was going to client dinners twice a week, expensive places too. I'd see the charges on our credit card, Moretti's, the Capitol Grill, places we'd never been to together. When I suggested we should go to one of these fancy restaurants sometime for date night, he'd say they were boring business places and suggest our usual chain restaurant instead. My sister Emma was the first person to say something. We were at Sunday family dinner at Mom's house, and David was being unusually charming, bringing flowers for Mom and complimenting her cooking more than usual. After he left to get something from the car, Emma pulled me aside and said, "Is everything okay with David? He seems different lately, like he's trying too hard." I immediately defended him, saying work had been stressful, and he was just being extra sweet to compensate for all the late nights. But even as I said it, something felt off. When I brought up Emma's comment to David later, he got irritated in a way that surprised me. "Your sister has always been jealous of our relationship," he said. "She's been single for 2 years and probably can't stand seeing us happy." That should have been a red flag too, because David had never said anything negative about Emma before. He started doing this thing where whenever I questioned anything, he'd flip it back on me. If I asked about a charge on our credit card, suddenly I was paranoid and controlling. If I mentioned he seemed distracted, I was needy and insecure. I found myself apologizing for asking perfectly reasonable questions about our life together. Looking back, I can see exactly how he was training me to stop asking questions at all. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove straight to First National Bank. I needed to see exactly what had happened to our money, and I needed to do it without David hovering over my shoulder with his banking error explanations. The teller, a young woman named Michelle, who I'd worked with before, looked genuinely uncomfortable when I asked to review our account history. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said quietly, glancing around like she was afraid someone might overhear, "I think you might want to speak with Mr. Rodriguez, our branch manager. Let me get him for you." When Mr. Rodriguez sat down across from me in his glass office, his expression was grave. "Mrs. Mitchell, I have to ask, are you aware of the withdrawal patterns on your joint savings account?" He turned his computer screen toward me and my stomach dropped to the floor. There it was, in black and white. Withdrawal after withdrawal, each one larger than the last. March 15th, $2,500 cash withdrawal. March 22nd, $5,000 transfer to an account I'd never seen before. April 3rd, $7,500 cash. April 18th, $8,000 transfer. May 2nd, $12,000 cash withdrawal. May 20th, another $8,000 transfer to that same mystery account. The list went on, and every single transaction was authorized by David's signature and PIN. "I don't understand," I whispered, staring at the screen. "Where did all this money go? What is this account number?" Mr. Rodriguez cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm not legally allowed to tell you who owns the receiving account, but I can tell you that your husband has been making these withdrawals and transfers consistently over the past 3 months. Each transaction required his physical presence and PIN authorization." I felt like I was going to be sick. $47,000. Gone. Our entire emergency fund, our vacation savings, the money we'd been setting aside for the down payment on our dream house, all of it systematically drained by my own husband. "What should I do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mr. Rodriguez leaned forward, his voice gentle but serious. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've been in banking for 20 years, and I've seen situations like this before. I strongly recommend you speak with a lawyer as soon as possible. These kinds of financial irregularities, they don't usually happen in isolation." As I walked back to my car on shaking legs, clutching the printed account statements, one thought kept running through my mind. If David could lie about this, what else had he been lying about? That afternoon, I did something I'd never done in 8 years of marriage. I went through David's digital life like a forensic investigator. I started with our shared iCloud account, which we'd set up years ago to share photos and documents. David was terrible with technology, so I'd always managed our digital storage. At first glance, everything looked normal. Recent photos of our last anniversary dinner, pictures from our weekend hiking trip, random screenshots of funny memes David had saved. But then I noticed something odd. Our shared photo stream showed we had 847 photos, but when I scrolled through them, I could only see about 600. That meant photos had been deleted. I clicked on the recently deleted folder, and my heart stopped. There they were, dozens of photos David had deleted over the past few months, pictures of him at restaurants I'd never been to, smiling widely at someone just outside the camera frame, photos of expensive wine bottles and fancy desserts, a selfie of David wearing a shirt I'd never seen, looking happier than he'd looked with me in months. And then, the gut punch, a photo of a woman's hand wearing a delicate silver bracelet with a small diamond pendant, taken from David's point of view, like he was admiring his handiwork. I recognized that bracelet. I'd seen it charged to our credit card for $340 2 months ago. When I'd asked David about it, he said it was a team appreciation gift for his assistant's birthday. Apparently, his assistant had very expensive taste. My hands were shaking as I kept digging. I logged into our email account and discovered something that made my blood run cold. David had created a second Gmail address, david.mitchell, personal@gmail.com. He'd been forwarding certain emails from our shared account to this secret address, including receipts from restaurants, confirmations from hotels, and order confirmations from jewelry websites. I pulled up our credit card statements online and cross-referenced them with David's supposed work schedule. The Grand Marriott downtown charged $289 on March 20th, the same day David told me he was working late on quarterly reports. Bella Cort's Italian restaurant, $156 on April 5th, when David said he was having a boring work dinner with clients. Tiffany & Comey, $820 on April 22nd, when David was supposedly at a mandatory company training seminar all day. But the smoking gun was the pattern of hotel charges. Every single one coincided perfectly with David's overnight work trips or late client meetings. The Riverside Inn, the boutique hotel, the Metropolitan Suites, all expensive, all romantic, all paid for with our money, while I sat at home grading papers and worrying about why my husband was working so hard. I sat back in my chair, staring at the evidence spread across multiple browser tabs, and laughed. Actually laughed. Because it was either that or scream. My husband wasn't just cheating on me. He was running a full-scale operation, complete with secret email accounts, deleted evidence, and a paper trail that would make a financial crimes detective weep with joy. David always said he was bad with details. Turns out he was just bad at covering his tracks. Armed with the evidence from David's digital breadcrumbs, I decided to play detective a little further, and that's when I discovered her. Her name was Amber Williams, and finding her was almost insultingly easy, because David had liked dozens of her Instagram photos over the past 4 months. Something I discovered when I went through his social media activity like the suspicious wife I apparently needed to be. Amber was 28, blonde, and described herself as a certified yoga instructor and wellness entrepreneur in her bio, which immediately made me want to roll my eyes because of course she was. Her Instagram was a carefully curated collection of yoga poses on beaches, smoothie bowls that probably cost more than my lunch budget for a week, and inspirational quotes about living authentically and manifesting abundance, which felt like a personal insult given that she was manifesting abundance with my husband's credit card. As I scrolled through her photos, my stomach churned with recognition after recognition. There was the silver bracelet with the diamond pendant from March, delicately displayed on her wrist in a photo captioned, "Grateful for unexpected gifts from the universe." The universe, apparently, had a checking account at First National Bank. In April, she posted a picture from Bella Cort's Italian restaurant, the same place David had charged $156 for his supposed client dinner, showing off a plate of lobster ravioli and a glass of wine that cost more than I spent on groceries. Her caption read, "Sometimes you have to treat yourself like the queen you are." And I wondered if she knew she was treating herself like a queen with someone else's life savings. The timeline was perfect, mathematically precise in its cruelty. Every expensive dinner, every piece of jewelry, every weekend getaway that David had claimed was work-related, corresponded exactly with Amber's Instagram posts of her suddenly elevated lifestyle. She was posting photos from the Riverside Inn the same weekend David told me he had to work overtime on a major client proposal, showing off room service champagne and a view of the city that I'd never seen, despite living here for 8 years. What really got to me was how she was living better than I was on my own money. While I was clipping coupons and buying generic brand everything to build our savings, Amber was posting photos of designer yoga pants, expensive skincare routines, and organic meal delivery services that cost more per day than I spent on food in a week. Her apartment, visible in the background of her mirror selfies, was clearly way beyond what a part-time yoga instructor could afford, complete with marble countertops and those trendy industrial light fixtures that cost a fortune. She had close to 3,000 followers who regularly commented things like "living your best life" and "you deserve everything good," and I found myself thinking that she really was living her best life, just entirely subsidized by my marriage. That evening, when David walked through the door with his usual cheerful, "Hey babe, how was your day?" I was sitting at the kitchen table with printouts of our credit card statements spread in front of me like evidence at a crime scene. I'd decided to start small, test the waters, see how he'd react to being questioned about some of the charges before I revealed everything I knew. "David, I was going through our credit card statements and I noticed some charges I don't remember. Bella Cort's Italian restaurant for $156. When did we go there?" His face barely flickered, but I caught the split second of panic before he shifted into what I now recognize as performance mode. "Oh, that," he said, setting down his briefcase and loosening his tie like he was preparing for a long explanation. "That was that client dinner I told you about, remember? With the Henderson account? I had to take them somewhere nice to close the deal." When I pointed out that the charge was on a Saturday, when he'd told me he was working late at the office, he laughed it off like I was being silly. "Sarah, you're getting confused. That was definitely a Thursday, and it was definitely work-related. You know how stressful things have been at the office lately." When I showed him the bank statements with all the large withdrawals, his tone shifted from patient to irritated. "Why are you going through our finances like this? You're acting paranoid, like you don't trust me. I've been working my ass off to provide for us, dealing with impossible clients and unreasonable deadlines, and instead of supporting me, you're here playing detective with our bank statements." He explained the cash withdrawals as business expenses that he'd get reimbursed for, waving his hand dismissively when I asked why he hadn't mentioned withdrawing thousands of dollars at a time. "I don't report every single financial transaction to you, Sarah. We're married, not business partners. The fact that you're sitting here interrogating me about spending my own money is honestly pretty insulting." By the time he was finished talking, I felt like I was the one who had done something wrong. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe work really was stressful and I wasn't being supportive enough. Maybe there were perfectly reasonable explanations for everything, and I was just being the crazy, suspicious wife who couldn't trust her hard-working husband. He ended the conversation by pulling me into a hug and saying, "I love you, but you need to stop looking for problems where there aren't any. You're creating stress in our marriage over nothing, and frankly, it's making everything harder for me." After David left for work the next morning, I called Jessica and asked if I could come over. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing my mind, that maybe I really was being paranoid and creating problems where none existed. But I needed someone else to look at the evidence and tell me if I was crazy or if something really was wrong. Jessica took one look at the bank statements and credit card charges I'd brought with me and said flatly, "Sarah, your husband is having an affair and stealing your money to pay for it. This isn't rocket science." When I started explaining David's reasoning for everything, how he'd made me feel like I was being unreasonable, Jessica held up her hand to stop me. "Listen to yourself. You're defending a man who withdrew $47,000 from your joint account without telling you. You're making excuses for charges at expensive restaurants you've never been to. You're apologizing for asking basic questions about your own finances. This is not normal behavior from you, and it's definitely not normal behavior from a faithful husband." I called my sister Emma next, and when I told her what was happening, there was a long pause before she said, "Oh, thank God you finally see it. Sarah, I've been worried about you for months." Emma admitted that she'd never really liked David, even back when we were dating, but she'd kept quiet because I seemed happy. "He always struck me as selfish and immature, but lately it's been worse. The way he talks to you, the way he dismisses your concerns, the way he makes everything about him. I've watched him gaslight you for months, and it's been killing me." When I asked what she meant by gaslighting, Emma explained how David had been systematically undermining my reality, making me question my own perceptions and memories. "Remember at Mom's birthday dinner when you mentioned feeling tired all the time? David immediately jumped in and said you'd been staying up too late watching Netflix, even though I know you go to bed at 9:30 every night. He was rewriting your own experiences right in front of us." Jessica suggested I talk to her divorce attorney, Margaret Stone, just to understand my options. "Even if you decide to work things out with David, you need to know where you stand legally, especially with this much money involved." Both of them helped me realize that the sick feeling in my stomach wasn't paranoia or insecurity. It was my intuition screaming that something was terribly wrong. Emma pointed out that I'd always been the most level-headed person in our family, the one everyone came to for advice, and suddenly I was second-guessing my own ability to read basic situations. "That's not a coincidence, Sarah. That's what happens when someone systematically manipulates you for months." By the time I left Jessica's house, I felt like I could breathe again for the first time in weeks. With Jessica and Emma's encouragement, I turned into a woman on a mission, systematically documenting every piece of evidence like I was building a case for the FBI. Jessica came over that weekend with her laptop and helped me create a detailed spreadsheet tracking every suspicious charge, withdrawal, and timeline discrepancy, while Emma took photos of all the bank statements and credit card bills with her phone, so we'd have multiple copies of everything. We cross-referenced David's work calendar, which he kept on our shared Google account, with every restaurant charge, hotel booking, and cash withdrawal. And the pattern was so obvious, it was almost insulting how little effort he'd put into covering his tracks. The most infuriating discovery came when Emma found Amber's GoFundMe page for her Sacred Space Yoga Studio, a campaign to raise money for her dream wellness center that would serve the community with authentic healing practices. The campaign had raised $23,000 over the past 3 months, with the largest donations coming from anonymous contributors. But when I looked at the dates of those donations and compared them to David's cash withdrawals, the math was perfect. My husband had essentially become Amber's private investor, funding her entrepreneurial dreams with our life savings while I was eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch to save money. Jessica helped me screenshot every single one of Amber's Instagram posts that corresponded with our credit card charges, creating a digital timeline that showed exactly how our money was being spent on her lifestyle, from the designer yoga mats she was hawking in her posts to the expensive wellness retreats she'd been attending in places like Sedona and Tulum. Emma discovered that Amber had recently signed a lease on a high-end apartment downtown, the kind of place with floor-to-ceiling windows and rooftop gardens that cost 3 times what we were paying for our mortgage. And when we looked up the rental price, it perfectly matched the monthly transfers David had been making to that mystery bank account. The most damning evidence came when I finally worked up the courage to look through David's laptop while he was at his weekly poker night, discovering a folder labeled Business Expenses that contained receipts for everything from Amber's yoga, teacher certification courses, to expensive lingerie from Victoria's Secret that I definitely never received. There were also drafts of emails to his boss requesting advances on his salary and overtime pay for projects that, according to his own work calendar, didn't exist. By Sunday night, we had assembled a portfolio of evidence that would make a private investigator proud, complete with financial records, photographic proof, timeline correlations, and documentation of David's systematic theft of our shared resources to fund his affair. Margaret Stone's law office was nothing like what I'd expected from watching legal dramas on TV. Instead of intimidating dark wood and leather-bound books, it was bright and welcoming, with comfortable chairs and tissues strategically placed on every surface, which probably should have been my first clue about the type of cases she handled. Margaret herself was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every type of marital disaster imaginable. When I spread my carefully organized evidence across her conference table, her expression shifted from professional interest to genuine shock. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, flipping through the bank statements and credit card records, "in 25 years of family law, I've rarely seen financial betrayal this systematic and extensive. What your husband has done goes far beyond infidelity. This is financial abuse, and depending on how we pursue it, potentially criminal fraud." She explained that David's use of joint funds to support his extramarital affair could be grounds for him to pay back every penny with interest, and that judges typically didn't look kindly on spouses who depleted marital assets for personal gain. "The fact that he's been funding another woman's business venture with your shared savings makes this even more egregious. You have an excellent case for maintaining primary control of your marital assets." As we discussed my financial situation, I mentioned almost offhandedly that David had inherited a trust fund from his grandmother, but that we'd never really needed to think about it since we were doing fine on our own. Margaret's pen stopped moving across her legal pad, and she looked up at me with sudden intense interest. "Tell me about this trust fund. Who's listed as the beneficiary?" When I explained that the lawyers had told us I'd automatically become the primary beneficiary when David and I married, and that David had basically ignored all the paperwork because he was terrible with legal stuff, Margaret's eyes lit up like she'd just struck gold. "Sarah," she said, leaning forward in her chair, "I need you to bring me every document related to that trust fund. Every single paper David signed, every correspondence from the estate lawyers, everything. This could change your entire situation." She explained that if I was indeed the legal beneficiary of the trust, it meant I had rights and protections that David might not even realize existed, and that his recent financial behavior could actually work in my favor in ways I couldn't imagine. Margaret called me 3 days later, and I could hear the excitement in her voice before she even said hello. "Sarah, you need to get down here immediately. Bring David's grandmother's death certificate and any other estate documents you can find, because what I've discovered is going to blow your mind." When I arrived at her office that afternoon, she had the trust documents spread across her desk like a treasure map, and her smile was the kind attorneys probably aren't supposed to have when discussing their clients' cases. "Your husband," she said, barely containing her glee, "is an idiot. Not only are you the primary beneficiary of this trust, but the trust is worth $850,000, which is significantly more than the enough that David described to you." She explained that Eleanor Mitchell had been a savvy investor who'd built a substantial portfolio over decades, and that David had inherited not just money but stocks, bonds, and real estate holdings that had been growing steadily since her death. "But here's the really beautiful part," Margaret continued. "According to the terms of the trust, any beneficiary can petition for immediate access to the funds if they can demonstrate that the current trustee is engaging in financially irresponsible behavior that threatens the family's economic stability. She showed me a clause in the trust documents that specifically mentioned protection against wasteful spending, gambling, or other behaviors that endanger the family's financial security, and explained that David's systematic draining of their joint savings to fund an extramarital affair fell squarely into that category. What your husband has done over the past 3 months gives us grounds to petition the court for immediate control of the trust assets, effectively removing him as a decision maker and transferring full authority to you as the primary beneficiary. Margaret had already contacted the estate attorney who'd handled Eleanor's will, who confirmed that the trust had specific provisions designed to protect against exactly the kind of behavior David had been exhibiting. Eleanor Mitchell was apparently a very smart woman who'd seen enough family drama to build safeguards into her estate planning, Margaret explained. She specifically wanted to ensure that if her heir ever endangered the family's financial stability through reckless behavior, the money would be protected. The most incredible part was that David had never bothered to read any of the trust documents carefully, signing everything the estate lawyers put in front of him without understanding what rights he was giving up or what protections were built into the system. He essentially signed away his ability to access this money if he ever behaved irresponsibly, Margaret said. And funding his mistress's yoga studio definitely qualifies as irresponsible behavior. As I sat in Margaret's office, staring at documents that represented more money than I'd ever imagined having, I realized that David's betrayal was about to become the most expensive mistake of his life. David must have sensed that something was shifting, because suddenly he turned into the most attentive husband on the planet, which felt like being courted by a used car salesman who knows the engine is about to fall out. He started bringing me flowers every other day, not just any flowers, but expensive arrangements from the fancy florist downtown, the kind that cost $60 and came with little cards about eternal love and appreciation for my beautiful wife. He planned a surprise romantic weekend getaway to the Riverside Inn, the same hotel I'd seen charged to our credit card during his supposed work trips, which was either incredibly stupid or incredibly arrogant, and I honestly couldn't decide which. "I know I've been working too much lately," he said, presenting me with a bottle of wine that probably cost more than our monthly grocery budget. "And I want to make it up to you. You deserve to be spoiled." The whole performance was so transparently manipulative that I almost felt sorry for him, watching him scramble to love-bomb me back into submission while having no idea that I knew exactly where he'd learned his romantic gestures. When the flower deliveries and expensive dinners didn't work and I remained politely distant, instead of melting back into grateful wife mode, David's approach took a sharp turn toward aggression. "You've been acting weird for weeks," he said one evening, his voice taking on an edge I'd rarely heard before. "You're cold, you're suspicious, you're constantly questioning me about every little thing. I don't know what's gotten into you, but frankly, Sarah, you're becoming exhausting to live with." He started making comments about how lucky I was to have him, how other men wouldn't put up with my paranoid behavior and trust issues, and how I should be grateful for everything he provided instead of constantly looking for problems. The mask was slipping faster than ice off a roof, and the man underneath was uglier than I'd ever imagined. "You know what?" he said during one particularly heated argument about my attitude. "Maybe I should just leave. Maybe you'd be happier alone, since you obviously don't appreciate anything I do for this marriage. But don't think you're going to take me for everything I'm worth just because you're unhappy." That's when he made the threat that sealed his fate. "If you want to play hardball, Sarah, you should know that you'll walk away from this marriage with nothing. I've got lawyers, I've got family money, and I've got a lot more resources than a third-grade teacher. You're lucky I love you enough to try to work this out, because if I wanted to, I could leave you with absolutely nothing." As I listened to him rant about his power and resources, threatening to destroy me financially while having no idea that I was about to become the sole controller of his grandmother's estate, I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. Margaret and I developed our strategy over coffee and legal documents, plotting David's downfall with the methodical precision of generals planning a military campaign. The key, Margaret explained, is to let him think he's winning while we systematically strip away every advantage he thinks he has. We need him confident and careless, not suspicious and covering his tracks. Our plan was beautifully simple. I would return home and play the role of the chastened, apologetic wife who'd realize the error of her paranoid ways, while Margaret worked behind the scenes to legally demolish David's world. I practiced my performance in Margaret's office, rehearsing how I'd apologize for being suspicious and unsupportive, how I'd praise David for his patience with my insecurities, and how I'd promise to trust him more and question him less. Make him feel like he's successfully manipulated you back into submission, Margaret advised. Men like David get sloppy when they think they've won. Meanwhile, Margaret filed a petition with the probate court to invoke the trust's financial protection clause, citing David's systematic depletion of marital assets as evidence of the financially responsible behavior that Eleanor Mitchell had specifically protected against. She also began drafting divorce papers, but we agreed to hold off on serving them until we had complete control of the trust fund, which would happen within 2 weeks if the judge approved our petition. The beauty of this approach, Margaret explained, is that David won't know what hit him until it's too late to do anything about it. By the time he realizes you're divorcing him, you'll already have legal control of the money he thinks belongs to him. I spent the weekend preparing for my Oscar-worthy performance, practicing how to be grateful and submissive while internally calculating exactly how much David's betrayal was going to cost him. Margaret had given me specific instructions about what evidence to continue gathering and how to document any additional financial misconduct without arousing suspicion. If he makes any more large withdrawals or transfers while we're waiting for the court decision, that's just more ammunition for our case, she said. The hardest part was going to be pretending everything was normal, while knowing that David's entire world was about to implode. But every time I felt guilty about the deception, I reminded myself of Amber's Instagram posts funded by my life savings and David's threats to leave me with nothing. Margaret scheduled a follow-up meeting for the following Friday, when she expected to have news about the trust fund petition, and we agreed that would be when we'd finalize the timeline for serving David with divorce papers and revealing exactly how much his affair was going to cost him. Playing the role of the apologetic, trusting wife was made infinitely easier when I discovered just how completely David had been planning to destroy my life. While he was at work on Wednesday, feeling confident that his love-bombing campaign had successfully beaten me back into submission, I decided to do one final sweep of his digital footprint, and what I found made my blood run cold with rage. David had been browsing apartment listings on Zillow, not just casual browsing, but serious research into 2-bedroom places in trendy neighborhoods across town. The kind of apartments that cost twice our current mortgage and came with amenities like rooftop pools and concierge services. He'd saved over a dozen listings to his favorites, all of them available for move-in dates in the next 60 days, and when I looked at the rent prices, they perfectly matched the amount he'd been transferring to that mystery bank account each month, which meant he'd been setting up his new life with Amber using our money while lying to my face about banking errors and work stress. Even worse, I found evidence that David had been job hunting, not just looking for new opportunities, but specifically searching for positions in other cities, places like Austin and Denver, where Amber had posted Instagram photos about dream destinations and new adventure possibilities. His resume was updated and polished, emphasizing skills and experiences I didn't even know he had, and he'd been corresponding with recruiters about relocating for the right opportunity and starting fresh in a new market. But the final nail in the coffin came when I managed to access his secret Gmail account and found months of text message screenshots he'd been emailing to himself. Apparently, as some kind of backup system, and reading those conversations between David and Amber was like watching a horror movie where I was the victim everyone was planning to murder. Once I deal with the Sarah situation, we can start looking at places together, he'd written, and I just need to figure out the cleanest way to extract myself from this marriage without losing everything. Amber had responded with heart emojis and messages about how excited she was to finally be able to go public with their love and how she couldn't wait to stop pretending they were just friends. They'd discussed timeline strategies, with David explaining that he needed to keep Sarah calm and unsuspicious while he moved assets around and positioned himself for the best possible outcome in a divorce. The most chilling message was David telling Amber, "Don't worry about the money situation. I've got it all figured out, and Sarah will never see it coming." As I sat there reading about my husband's meticulous plans to abandon me while stealing our life savings, I realized that every gentle word, every apology, every moment of seeming regret over the past months had been a calculated performance designed to keep me docile while he systematically dismantled our marriage. Friday evening, I sat David down at our kitchen table with my carefully organized evidence spread out like a prosecutor presenting a case to a jury. "We need to talk," I said, and something in my tone must have warned him that his performance as the devoted husband was over, because his face went white before I even started speaking. I began with the bank statements, the credit card charges, and the deleted photos, watching him cycle through his greatest hits of manipulation tactics like a broken record. "Sarah, I can explain everything," he started, but I held up my hand and told him to save it because I wasn't finished yet. When I showed him the screenshots of Amber's Instagram posts, the timeline of charges that perfectly matched her lifestyle upgrades, and the evidence of his secret email account, he tried a different approach. Complete denial. "You're misinterpreting everything," he said, his voice taking on that condescending tone I'd learned to hate. "Amber is just a friend. Those charges are work-related, and you're connecting dots that don't exist because you want to find something wrong with our marriage." When I pulled out the apartment listings he'd been browsing and the job applications he'd submitted in other cities, his denial crumbled into minimization. "Okay, maybe I've been talking to Amber more than I should have, but nothing physical has happened, and I was only looking at apartments because I thought maybe we needed space to work on our relationship. But when I read him his own text messages about dealing with the Sarah situation and extracting himself from this marriage, he finally gave up the pretense and admitted to the affair. "Fine, yes, I've been seeing Amber, but it just happened, Sarah. I didn't plan this. I'm confused about my feelings, and I don't know what I want anymore." The thing that truly amazed me was his complete lack of remorse about stealing our money. When I confronted him about the $47,000, he actually had the audacity to say, "I was going to pay it back eventually, and besides, it's not like we were starving or anything." He suggested we could work through this if I could be more understanding about his needs and less controlling about finances, as if his systematic theft and betrayal were relationship issues we could solve with better communication. "I love you, Sarah," he said, reaching across the table like he expected me to take his hand. "But you have to understand that our marriage hasn't been meeting my emotional needs lately, and Amber makes me feel appreciated in ways that you don't." When it became clear that I wasn't going to fall to my knees thanking him for his honesty and begging him to work on our marriage, David's mask didn't just slip, it completely disintegrated, revealing the entitled, calculating person he'd apparently always been underneath. "Look, Sarah," he said, leaning back in his chair with an expression that can only be described as smug, "if we're really going to go down this road, you need to understand how divorce works. I'm entitled to half of everything we've built together, which includes the house, the savings, the retirement accounts, and obviously half of my grandmother's trust fund." The audacity was breathtaking, But he was just getting started. He actually had the nerve to claim that he deserved spousal support because he'd sacrificed his career advancement for our marriage, which was such a spectacular rewriting of history that I almost choked on my own tongue. David had never been the primary breadwinner in our relationship. I had always made more money as a teacher than he did in insurance, and the only career sacrifice in our marriage had been me turning down a principal position 2 years ago because David didn't want to move to a different school district. I could have been making 6 figures by now if I hadn't been supporting your career and taking care of the household responsibilities, he continued, apparently forgetting that I did all the cooking, cleaning, bill paying, and emotional labor while he played poker with his friends twice a week and spent weekends watching sports. But the piece de resistance came when he started talking about the trust fund with the kind of confident ownership that made me want to record the conversation just so I could play it back later and laugh. The trust fund is obviously going to be split 50-50 since it's a marital asset, and honestly, Sarah, you should probably just take whatever settlement I'm willing to offer because fighting me on this is going to cost you more in legal fees than you'll ever recover. He explained that his family had money and connections, that he'd already spoken to some of the best divorce attorneys in the state, and that I should be realistic about my position as someone with limited resources going up against someone with generational wealth and legal expertise. The way he talked about the trust fund, you'd think he'd been managing it personally for years, instead of ignoring every piece of paperwork related to it and letting me handle all our financial planning because he wasn't good with that stuff. I'm trying to be fair here, he said, like he was doing me some enormous favor. But if you want to drag this out and make it ugly, just remember that I've got $850,000 in assets that you'll never touch, plus whatever we split from the marital property. Margaret's timing was absolutely perfect, showing up at our door on Monday morning while David was still in his bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, probably planning another day of pretending to be the wronged party in our marriage. David Mitchell, she said with the kind of professional smile that attorneys perfect when they're about to ruin someone's life. You've been served. The divorce papers were just the appetizer. But the real main course was the thick folder of trust fund documents that Margaret handed him with an explanation that made his coffee mug slip from his fingers and shatter on our kitchen floor. Mr. Mitchell, I need to inform you that your wife, Sarah, is the primary and sole beneficiary of the Eleanor Mitchell Trust, which means she has legal authority over all trust assets, including the $850,000 you've been counting on in your divorce settlement. I watched David's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and then pure panic as Margaret explained that not only would he not be receiving half of the trust fund, but that his recent financial behavior had triggered the trust's protection clauses, effectively removing him from any decision-making authority over the assets he'd inherited. Furthermore, Margaret continued, clearly enjoying every word, the systematic withdrawal of funds from your joint marital account to support an extramarital relationship constitutes financial misconduct that could be prosecuted as theft, and will be seeking full restitution of the $47,000 you've stolen, plus damages and attorney fees. When David's hastily hired lawyer, some bargain basement attorney he'd found online, reviewed the trust documents later that week, he had to deliver the news that David's situation was even worse than it initially appeared. Mr. Mitchell, his lawyer explained in a phone call that I could hear through our thin bedroom walls, not only do you have no legal claim to the trust fund, but your wife's legal team has documented evidence of financial fraud that could result in criminal charges if she chooses to pursue them. My recommendation is that you agree to whatever settlement they're offering and consider yourself lucky if you walk away without going to jail. The sound that came out of David when he hung up the phone wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a sob, but it was definitely the sound of a man realizing that his elaborate plan to leave his wife for his mistress while keeping all the money had just backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. The next few weeks were like watching a masterclass in manipulation as David cycled through every tactic in the emotional abuser's playbook, desperately trying to claw back some control over a situation that had completely escaped his grasp. First came the threats, delivered in that cold, controlled voice he used when he wanted to intimidate me. "You have no idea what you're doing, Sarah. You're going to destroy both of our lives over this, and when you're sitting in some crappy apartment wondering how you're going to pay rent, don't come crying to me." When I responded with nothing more than a calm, "Okay," he switched to bargaining mode, suddenly becoming the repentant husband who'd made a terrible mistake and just needed one more chance. "I'll cut all contact with Amber immediately," he promised, pacing around our living room like a caged animal. "I'll go to therapy, marriage counseling, whatever you want. We can work through this if you just drop the divorce proceedings and give me a chance to prove I've changed." The love bombing phase was particularly pathetic, with David bringing me flowers every day, cooking elaborate dinners I didn't eat, and leaving handwritten notes about how much he loved me and how sorry he was for losing his way. When none of that worked, he resorted to the kind of desperate begging that would have been heartbreaking if it weren't coming from someone who'd spent months systematically betraying me while planning to leave me with nothing. "Please, Sarah," he said one evening, literally on his knees in our hallway, "I know I screwed up, but I can't lose everything. That trust fund is all I have. It's my future, my security. You can't just take it all away from me." When I calmly explained that the trust fund had never belonged to him in the first place and walked away, David's desperation took a darker turn. And he began a campaign to turn everyone we knew against me with lies about my vindictive behavior and unreasonable demands. He called his parents, our mutual friends, even some of my colleagues at school, spinning a story about how I was trying to steal his inheritance and destroy his life over a mistake. He painted himself as the victim of a bitter, money-hungry wife who was taking advantage of a legal technicality to steal everything he'd worked for, conveniently leaving out the parts about the affair, the stolen money, and his plans to abandon me. Some people actually believed him, which hurt more than I expected, but the ones who mattered saw right through his manipulation. 6 months later, I was sitting in Margaret's office signing the final divorce decree, officially ending my marriage to David and beginning what I can only describe as the most satisfying chapter of my adult life. The judge had been particularly unsympathetic to David's arguments about unfair distribution of assets, especially after Margaret presented evidence of his systematic financial fraud and plans to abandon me while stealing our life savings. I kept the house, which had been purchased primarily with money from my father's life insurance policy anyway, maintained full control of the Eleanor Mitchell Trust with its $850,000 in assets, and David was ordered to repay every penny of the $47,000 he'd stolen from our joint account, plus interest and my legal fees. The cherry on top was when Amber dumped David exactly 3 days after the divorce was finalized, apparently having figured out that her sugar daddy had turned into a financial liability overnight. According to Jessica, who'd become friends with one of Amber's yoga students, she'd already moved on to a divorced real estate developer who could better fund her wellness journey, leaving David with nothing but a lease on an expensive apartment he could no longer afford and a broken lease penalty that cost him another $3,000. David's desperate attempts to vilify me to our mutual friends had largely backfired, especially when people started asking questions about why exactly I was divorcing him and discovered the truth about his affair and financial betrayal. My sister Emma had been particularly effective at spreading the real story, armed with screenshots and bank statements that made David's victim narrative fall apart under scrutiny. His own parents, after learning the full extent of what he'd done, had apparently told him he was on his own and that they were ashamed of how he'd treated such a good woman. The final humiliation came when David had to file for bankruptcy due to his legal fees, credit card debt from funding Amber's lifestyle, and the court-ordered restitution he owed me, which meant his credit was destroyed and he'd be living paycheck to paycheck for years while I was investing trust fund money and planning the European vacation I'd always dreamed of taking. Margaret had warned me that I might feel guilty about David's financial ruin, but honestly, watching someone face the natural consequences of their own calculated cruelty felt less like revenge and more like cosmic justice, finally catching up with someone who'd thought he was too smart to get caught. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I'm sitting in my completely renovated kitchen, sipping coffee from a mug that cost more than David probably spends on groceries in a week, and I can honestly say I've never been happier in my entire life. The house looks completely different now, transformed from the modest starter home David and I shared into something that actually reflects my personality instead of his cheap, corner-cutting aesthetic. I used some of the trust fund money to knock out the wall between the kitchen and dining room, install those gorgeous quartz countertops I'd always wanted, and create the kind of open, light-filled space that makes me smile every time I walk into it. I took that European vacation I'd been dreaming about for years, spending 3 weeks in Italy eating incredible food, visiting museums, and not checking my phone once, which felt like the most luxurious thing I'd ever done. When I got back, I started the Eleanor Mitchell Scholarship Fund for Teachers, using part of the trust money to help educators pursue advanced degrees and professional development, which I think David's grandmother would have approved of since she'd been a teacher herself before she became a savvy investor. The best part of my new life, though, is Michael, the contractor who renovated my kitchen and somehow managed to restore my faith in decent men who actually mean what they say. He's kind, honest, financially responsible, and when he says he's working late, he's actually working late, not funding some other woman's entrepreneurial dreams with money that doesn't belong to him. Meanwhile, David is living in a studio apartment above a pizza place, working his insurance job during the day and delivering food at night to pay off his court-ordered debts, which gives me more satisfaction than it probably should. According to Emma, who gets updates through our old neighbor, he looks about 10 years older than he did during our marriage, probably from the stress of actually having to face consequences for his actions for the first time in his adult life. So tell me, did I go too far or not far enough? Because honestly, I'm sleeping better than I have in years.